All right, and we are recording. Okay. Today's Friday, November 18th. I'm sitting here with Chief Richard O'Brien of the Goffstown Fire Department. Thanks for sitting down with me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We're going to talk a little bit about clandestine drug labs and some of the things that we see, some of the things that we run into, and can be, some of the hazards that can be expected. I guess probably the best place to start is like right at the beginning. If you walk into a situation where you get called to a lab and you get called to have to deal with a scene, what are some of the things that you usually expect to see when you arrive?
Well, when it comes to clandestine labs, we realize that not just locally, but we have to learn nationally what to prepare for. Labs can now not typically be just in a home, be in a storage unit. It could be located in a remote location, whether it be a shed or even in a vehicle. So it's tough to prepare exactly what to look for. There is telltale signs that kind of indicate that something is going on that's unusual, whether it be a smell or a funny-looking LP propane tank that's got corrosions around the regulator of the neck. But it's one of those things where you almost have to get too close to realize the hazard, and that's the problem that we have in the educational programs that we put on for our first responders, are to try to pound in those telltale signs and realizing that they may be in on something where they want to back out and reevaluate and get some of the professionals that deal with it. And that's what basically we would do. Using a unified command system, our approach would be to get with our law enforcement partners and realize that we may have something on our hands, and just approaching it just a lab in a sense where it's a hazmat call, because that's the way we would treat it, but it's also a crime scene. And chances are, from experience from out west, labs that have been discovered, that they could be booby trapped. There could be booby traps throughout the scene, targeted towards first responders and law enforcement. So keeping that in mind, we're going to approach these scenes cautiously. But for us locally, especially here in New Hampshire, where we've had a couple here in town. There's been several every year. It seems like that are discovered throughout New Hampshire. That's unusual enough, but it's becoming more prevalent. So when we do discover a lab, we have to contact the right people, the right professionals that deal with it. DES, New Hampshire DES is our prime agency that we would probably contact, along with the state police. But again, it's a unified command between our law enforcement and the fire service in order to mitigate something like this.
Okay. Some of the things that can be used, I know that from my own research, just in having gone through a lot of documentation that I have, some of the stuff that I've gotten from the federal government, some of the stuff that I've gotten from the state. I have a toxicology reference that I've been working with to pull down information and to look for things that you can find. And I know that there are a lot of things that you can find at the scene of a lab that can be used. I mean, I look at some of what's there. I see like solvents are usually pretty common. Things like benzene, toluene, ethers, anything like that. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, well, two things actually, that I thought was really interesting that I didn't expect to ever find in some of the research that I've done already, is that a couple of products, or a couple of not products, that's not the word I'm looking for, but a couple of the materials, some of the materials, like the reactant materials that are used, sort of surprised me when I saw that racing fuel was on that list, or another one like Coleman fuels for stoves. What would they be used for?
Well, they're used to activate or create a chain reaction in the chemical, and when it comes to clandestine labs, they'll try anything to get their end result, or think that they got the end result. And a lot of times, the reason why we're being called is if they're doing this in close proximity to our neighbor or to the next apartment, all of a sudden it gives off noxious fumes.
Mm-hmm.
And we get the suspicious, check a smell or check a hazard call. To us, we'd sit there and go, oh, it's probably somebody, dumping some gasoline and they didn't clean it up properly. And so most people smell gasoline. But if we get there and it's more of an acidic smell, or you get a common fuel smell, something that's unusual. We usually smell propane, natural gas. It's got that odorant in it. In gasoline, it's very detectable, or even home heating fuel.
Mm-hmm.
It's a typical smell we deal with day to day as homeowners or just people in general. But then all of a sudden, we get this other pungent, sweet smell or other fuel smell. It heightens our awareness on what's going on. Again, these types of incidences are low probability in our environment, but they're high risk. So that's why we approach it differently. But again, it's we can never sit there and say, okay, if you smell A, B, or C chemical, be prepared. It's probably a clandestine lab.
Mm-hmm.
We're finding that when it comes to the drug producers like this, that they're using any material possible to make that chemical reaction occur to get their end result. So whether it be something to break down that catalyst or be the catalyst, it could be anything. I know pharmacies are being very careful on distributing pseudoephedrines.
Yeah.
Because you can't even get a cough drop now without signing out. So that's helping, but the thing is, what that does is it forces these folks to find some other drug or catalyst to get their end product.
Yes, actually, as far as I actually wanted to touch on that a little bit, as far as the issue of pseudoephedrine and how it's handled, in a retail pharmacy or somewhere like that, because I know that since it's become so prevalent, it's been a while now. It's probably been 5-6 years that this has been going on, where you can walk into a pharmacy and if you need some sort of cold medication, and the most common, Sudafed, Actifed, anything that contains pseudoephedrine to act as a decongestant, you have to actually get it behind the counter now. And that that's a DEA that's a DEA mandate, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And just in terms of the materials that are used to actually, as you say, to catalyze that out, or to break it down so that it can be made or transformed into that form that is used. It's pretty frightening to see some of the things that are used to do that. I mean, if you walk into somebody's, you walk into anybody's home, probably walk into my own house, and I wouldn't be surprised if under my kitchen sink or in my garage, I have some of those same materials.
Right. Anything they're using anything from Drano to any kind of pool chemicals. They're exploring anything. They're turning themselves into backyard chemists, and so we can't when we approach scenes like this, we have to prepare to not just look for the typical chemicals that you would suspect, but it's any chemical. So what would happen in, like, for example, in my community, I get DES involved. That's going to get their professionals rolling, but we also belong to a regional hazmat team. It's called the Southern Sauhegan Area Response Team, which is it's a regional hazmat team, and they're based out of Nashua. And what would happen is they would send up immediately. We call hazmat technicians, and they're their technical guys. So they're gonna respond here first, meet with the unified command, and determine what products are easily accessible, where the hot zone is, meaning where chemicals are currently being stored or off gassing, where it could be a hazard to the community, and warm zones and cold zones. Warm zone is kind of like that working area between the two, and the cold zone is where the unified command post would be, and we would be staging resources and personnel outside that area so that nobody gets exposed. So we're going to, at a glance, we're going to try to figure out, we're going to probably send in a team of two to recon the incident to determine what chemicals could be at hand, quantities, and if they can identify anything. Because at that point they'll come out and a researcher will look at what they can find on those chemicals to determine how to address pulling them away from the scene, what containers we need to put them in, and even how to even touch them, because there's certain type of gloves that will mandate certain types of chemicals. So a lot of that will be working at the same time. It's going to be a long process. If it's a large lab, it could take hours, if not days, to mitigate this hazard. If it's a smaller lab, let's say a vehicle, it could possibly be done in a few hours. Mm-hmm. So depending on the magnitude of what's going on, and if there's any chemicals that are either seeped into the ground or just storage containers that are outside and leaking, all that is taken into consideration and determine, like I said, when we do the inventory of what chemicals are on scene, we try to determine which is the most volatile and deal with those first, and then, or if there's so much volatile components on scene, we approach it differently. In fact, I think there was a case where out in California there was so much volatile chemicals stored on scene in the house, they just chose to evacuate the rest of the neighborhood and just burn the chemical right there, because they couldn't take all those chemicals out of there or hazards without creating a bigger hazard.
I think I remember hearing about that actually. That was actually not that long ago.
No.
That actually brings me to two other questions that kind of interesting how you talk about one thing and it leads to something else and it causes you to think of other things. And this actually made me think of two things immediately that I think are interesting questions to sort of explore. First of all, you talked about the size of the lab. I mean, anything, room like this, somebody's house. I know that when I worked in Manchester, there was an incident up in the north end. I think it was on Harrison Street. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago, where there was a lab that was found in the first floor of a triple-decker house, and there were people that were living in the second and third floors. It was pretty bad, and I was there for that. I mean, I was part of the EMS crew that was there for that response, and it was pretty difficult because there were small children that were involved. So that was another consideration. But the first thing that comes to mind immediately as far as size, one of the things that I had talked with Les about when I spoke with him was the whole idea of the lab becoming almost like nano-sized, like basically, from the concept of a lab in a bottle, if you like. Right. He had described, I think the term he used was, I think he called it a shake and bake lab. Mm-hmm. I'd never heard that term, but I thought it was kind of interesting because he had talked about the reactants that you need. I mean, obviously, when you're creating something like this, you need a heat source. You need a heat source to make it work. And if you don't have an external heat source, you need something that's reactive. And he talked about taking batteries apart and using the lithium in the batteries. Mm-hmm. That strikes me as being really, really easy to do, because if you can get a hold of batteries, I mean, if you can get a hold of rechargeable batteries, you can do that. I mean, is that something that can be, do you need a lot of it? I guess is the question.
Yeah, it goes into what you were saying before, is how big the lab is, how big of the operation that they choose to do it. And a lot of times they're doing in the trunk of a car or in a van or a box truck, or they're doing in a hotel room. They'll set up shop in a hotel room for a few nights, and they'll start producing the stuff and they'll leave. It's kind of scary if you're thinking about it, because if you show up in a hotel room and it kind of smells funny, like you wonder what happened in here. Mm-hmm. So that's the thing, is they're getting as creative as possible, and nothing will stop them. As soon as they figure out, what they can use for a heat source, a reactant, even a container, they're going to explore it and they're going to try to use it. What happens a lot of times when we get called in is in their experimentation process, something fails, and that's when they'll get a release, a container fails or blows open, and if close proximity to neighbors, like I said, it's when we get the phone call and we're walking in on something that could be very hazardous.
It makes me think of the whole issue of a pressure release, especially when you're dealing with some of the reactants that you have that are pretty, they talk about volatility. Pressure is always generated. As with heat, generally you find with increased temperature comes increased pressure. And when you have increased pressure in like for example, in like a 1 liter soda bottle, that could blow apart.
It's like a Mentos in a Diet Coke.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So again, the system is only as good as a container, and they learn by practicing, and you got to realize that the labs that are very large, they're using typically using lab quality materials. It's the ones that are the small operations that are not, and that's one of the things where when we're looking at approaching, say, a suspected clandestine lab in a van or a car, we're gonna take baby steps going in there, because realizing that they're probably using stuff that maybe a gasoline container that was bought at the hardware store, and a plastic jug that used to hold bleach or something like that. So they're not lab quality containers, and they have a tendency to fail catastrophically, and depending on the where they're at in the process. So it's a tough situation for first responders, because we really have to shift gears on our typical approach to scenes. Is where we get called for emergency, we're going in, and our job is to mitigate the issue as fast as we can, and in return for the next call. But in this case now we approach it gingerly, assess, try to plan our approach back up, and start removing hazards appropriately. But the thing is, we don't know where the next one's going to be. A hunter, it's hunting season right now. A hunter could come across something in the middle of the woods. We could have, I kind of joke, with you see the latest show now, of course, Storage Wars. It's called Storage Wars. I'm waiting for him to one of these, during the auction, have him snap the lock and fling open the door, and you'll see a clandestine lab sitting there.
Actually, it's kind of funny that you mentioned Storage Wars, because there was on one of the trailers that they had, and I saw this probably, a month ago. They opened up, they popped the lock, they opened it up, and it was booby trapped. And there were explosives in it that actually were active and had started going off. I mean, they weren't it wasn't high yield or high quantity, but it was enough that it really, it was an attention getter, and it really got my attention. And all I could think of was, my God, what if there was a lab in there? Or what if they weren't making, what if they were making, what if they were making drugs? What if they were making, what if they were making weapons? What if they were making TNT? What if they were, making any number of things? Because we know that labs are used for any number of things besides drugs. I mean, the reports are just, they're just in order of magnitude, just seem to keep increasing every time you turn around, and it's always something different. Right. Which is kind of frightening. Second question that I had, going back to that other, going back to the other, the other thing that we were talking about. I'd mentioned in the call that I had been on in Manchester, where there were kids involved. Let's talk a little bit about the health effects of some of this stuff, both maybe a little bit about the acute effects and maybe some of the chronic effects, some of the things that happen longer term. Because the thing that comes to mind to me immediately is respiratory effects. I mean, especially with some of the chemicals and the reactions and the gases they produce.
Right. You've got the immediate things that we look for is the respiratory effects, and then because of that, you can have neurological effects. And so those are the things that telltale signs you could see right away, where you can see somebody dazed, passed out, they're just confused, difficulty breathing. But for example, there's some law enforcement officers that approach several of these labs without any protection, without any PPE or SCBAs on, and they had mild exposures, or they thought they had mild exposures because of the chemicals, because they smelt it, but they were never overcome. But later on, they had like say kidney failure, or later on they had different cancers crop up, and they actually died of it. So it's one of those things where not knowing exactly the chemicals that are bombarding you when you're exposed to this, you obviously have to treat the immediate issue at hand, which would be respiratory.
Which would be the respiratory issues, or in the case of an altered mental status, as you say, that can also be due to potentially be due to a hypoxic condition. So sure.
Yeah, or it could be chemical intoxication. So it's one of those things where what's important here is obviously when you approach the scene like that and you have victims, first of all you got to decon them. You have to decon them, see if any of the material is still on them. So you're gonna have to be you have to get all the clothes off of them and then do a gross decon, get whatever you can get off of them, and then get them into that clean environment and start treating them. But the key is to let your hospital know that you're coming and prepare them, because they may have a decon process that they might want to implement just so they don't contaminate their facilities, and they're probably going to do that. And also it gets the doctors involved to talk to other folks that may be exposed to typical situations like that, perhaps West or something like that. They may want to reach out for resources on how to treat some of these patients to a chemical exposure. But for at that point, once our folks are treating and transporting somebody, a victim like the kids that you had, it's really important to have the hazmat team have an open conduit or communication link to the physicians at the hospital to keep them abreast of what chemicals were found, and to kind of give the physicians an idea what to expect as far as chemical toxicity, and what symptoms to expect, and what to possibly test the patient, whether it be a blood test or other chemical style tests.
Sure. Urine samples. If there's anything on them, they could probably still anything on there that hasn't been taken off in a gross decontamination. Probably like skin swabs, even something to that. As easy as that.
They also do what they call the heavy metal test.
Oh,
and that's a blood test that they do. It's not typical. Usually when you go in the ER, whether it's for an illness, or even prepping for surgery, they'll do a CBC. That's a complete blood count, and there's a certain number of things that are measured. But then they call it what we call heavy metal. Now it's all those chemical components that are being broken down in your system. They can actually start measuring that.
Sure.
And it's an unusual blood test to order. So you may want to the hazmat guys may want to key into the physicians in the ER and say, this is what I would probably do, is look into a heavy metals test initial and do a follow-up at some point in time to see if there's building effects in this person's system.
And the things that come to mind immediately that they would look for would be things like lead or cadmium or mercury or
anything. And that's the thing is, even why it's so important is it gives you a telltale sign of how much of these metals are being introduced into the bloodstream. It may not show right away when you get to the ER on these victims, but again, if you do a baseline test when they arrive, and then do a follow-up even 36 hours later, they'd be able to see if there's okay, now we're starting to see long-term effects of this exposure on this patient.
Excuse me. I guess that wasn't important. As far as going a little bit further on with that, I guess there's one other thing that I wondered about, and with all of this stuff that shows up, I know that like you had mentioned the Department of Environmental Services. What do they do in terms of do they contract out as far as having as far as mitigators, companies that dispose of
the state that's what's really important when you look at a community like Goffstown. We want to involve the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services as soon as possible, because they're going to be the conduit to federal cleanup funds, because chances are these folks don't have insurance to clean up this kind of a spill. And frankly, with the budgets the way they are, we don't have the money available in my budget or the town's budget to clean up a chemical spill to that magnitude. So it's really important to get the DS friends on board as soon as possible, because they're going to be that conduit for federal cleanup funds. what happens is New Hampshire DES has a contracted cleanup agency that they contract with. I believe this time it could be like a company like Empro or Clean Harbors.
Yep.
And what that does is it gives you, for the immediate sense, they can come in and immediately respond to your incident, be an advocate for the state, and this vendor is going to now work with the state and the responders and go, okay, we're gonna contain these chemicals on scene and get them out of here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then they'll be working with the state and locals to determine where we're going to go with the secondary part of the cleanup. Is the room cleanup, or if it's a vehicle, who's going to take the vehicle?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a storage unit, who's going to clean the storage unit? All those responsibilities start getting handed down, and the state has a good handle on who's going to do that, and ultimately who's going to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, the feds have a fund established for responses like this. But if the case here is, for example, if we had a suspected clandestine lab, and we call our hazmat team, but we never involved DES, the federal funds will never be made available, because the federal funds don't come directly to the locals.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be conduited through state government.
Okay, great. This has been really helpful, and given me, it's like every time I open a door, I find something a little bit different. So, and I find more than what I had before, and this has been really good, and I really appreciate your being willing to sit down with me and talk about all of this stuff.
Great.
Thank you very much.
All right.
All right.